Welcome back to the Next Mission podcast. I'm your host, Alex Leonovich. If you've been following our series over the last several weeks, we've been walking through and discussing one of the biggest milestones in life, buying a home. We've talked about financing, getting pre-approved, understanding underwriting, writing competitive offers, and the VA home loan. And last week, we discussed homeowners insurance, why every homeowner needs it, what it generally covers, and just as importantly, what it doesn't. And today we're going to spend the entire episode talking about one of those exclusions, flood insurance. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Alex, I don't live on the beach. Or maybe I live nowhere near the Gulf of Mexico. Or perhaps my lender didn't require flood insurance, so it must be okay. And those are reasonable assumptions. There are also some of the biggest misconceptions I encounter when working with buyers here in the Greater Tampa Bay area. Whether you're purchasing your first home in Wesley Chapel, which is miles, tens of miles from the beach or from the Gulf, or maybe a waterfront property in Gulf Harbors, or a retirement home in Palm Harbor, where I live, or maybe you're relocating to another one of the communities in the area, maybe Riverview or Trinity, Clearwater, or St. Petersburg. Understanding flood insurance and the risks is one of the smartest financial decisions you can make. Because here's something that I've learned with helping families buy homes. People rarely regret learning as much as they can before buying. They regret the surprises that come afterward, but never the learning beforehand. And today I want to help you avoid one of those surprises. All right, here we go. Imagine this. You've moved to Florida after spending 20 years living, or in my case, in the military, stationed in Colorado. You've dreamed about this for years. You find a beautiful home in Palm Harbor, and Palm Harbor is beautiful. It's clean, the house is clean, the inspection goes great, the appraisal comes back at value, your mortgage has been approved, everything that we've talked about is falling into place. And then your insurance agent calls you and says, good news, your homeowner's insurance looks great. Then they pause. But because this property is in a flood evacuation zone, your flood insurance is going to be another, let's say, $2,700 a year. And suddenly, that monthly payment that you've been carefully budgeting has increased by, I'm doing the math, a little over $200 a month, right? Nobody mentioned this during the first showing. Nobody talked about it when you were imagining where all the furniture was going to go. And now you're sitting here wondering, can I still afford this house? Unfortunately, this scenario happens more often than people really realize. Not because anyone is trying to hide something, right? But because buyers often don't know the right questions to ask until they're already emotionally invested. And we've talked about this in previous episodes about planning and preparation before we get emotionally attached, right? Because that's only natural. It's human. So one of my goals as your realtor is to make sure that doesn't happen, that you're able to plan and make good decisions before that emotional attachment happens. Or at least for me, staying not emotionally attached to help you make good decisions. Because preparation creates confidence. And confidence comes from understanding the complete picture. It's not just about the purchase price. So what are we going to cover today? By the end of today's episode, I would want you to understand the following. What is flood insurance and why homeowners insurance doesn't cover flooding, right? Two separate things. I also want you to understand why homes miles from the Gulf Coast can still experience flooding damage. I want you to understand how the FEMA flood zones actually work. I want you to appreciate why two nearly identical homes can have dramatically different insurance premiums. I want you to understand the questions you should ask before making an offer, especially here in Florida. And I want you to understand how your property's flood risk, or how to understand the flood risk before closing, could save you thousands of dollars over the life of your home, right? And we'll go through all these. So whether you currently own a home, you're thinking about buying one, or you're relocating to Florida, today's conversation is designed to help you make informed decisions, not fearful ones. Because that's the point, that's what this episode is all about. It's about helping you prepare, helping you understand, and helping you make confident real estate decisions. Before we decide which flood insurance makes sense for our family, we first need to understand something much more basic. What actually causes flooding in Florida? Because the answer may surprise you, and it may be very different from where you currently live. When most people picture flooding, they imagine a hurricane making landfall here in Florida, huge waves crashing over the seawalls, boats floating down the streets. And those images certainly do happen. We've seen them on TV. But here's what's interesting. Many of the flood insurance claims filed in Florida don't begin with a massive flood surge. They begin with rain. Just rain. It's August right now. We are in the heavy part of what I like to call the monsoon season. We're about 6 weeks late this year, but the last 2 weeks we've had it felt like a torrential downpour every single day, inches of rain, right? Just to give you an understanding, it's been raining every single day, huge thunderstorms, an hour of rain, probably 2 inches an hour rainfall. I'm just pouring. And it's just rain, right? It's not a hurricane. It's not a tropical storm. It is just a summer rainfall here in Florida. And that's one of the first things people moving to Florida really need to understand. Florida floods differently than other parts of the country, right? In my military career, I've lived all over. I grew up in Vermont, in New England. I've lived in Virginia. I've lived in the Carolinas, Tennessee, Colorado, Texas, and each of them is different. And the Greater Tampa Bay area has several characteristics that make flood risk really unique. First, we're relatively flat. So you can drive from Tarpon Springs, which is out on the Gulf, inland 25 miles to Wesley Chapel, and there is no rise in the elevation. It is completely flat. And if you're going from the south, from Tampa to Wesley Chapel, very little elevation change there either, right? Water doesn't quickly run and clear out here like it might in a more hilly terrain or mountainous terrain, like Tennessee or maybe North Carolina. Instead, it spreads, it pools, and it's looking for that lowest possible point. And if the storm drains in the neighborhoods and around town can't move the water fast enough, neighborhoods and streets begin to flood. Second, the water table is very high or very close to the surface here in Florida. And if you're not familiar with water table, think of it, the water that's stored underneath the ground, where your well is drawing from and those sorts of things, right beneath your feet. And during long periods of sustained rain, that underground storage fills very quickly. We have a lot of sand here. It goes straight through. And when those aquifers fill up, and once it's full, and it has nowhere to go. And so that's when yards and driveways and streets begin to pool water and form ponds. Roadways, because they're concrete and can't, disperse water, begin to collect water. Our retention ponds, which you'll see all over neighborhoods and communities here in Florida, they begin to rise. And that's when neighborhoods that have never experienced problems before can suddenly see standing water. And third, Florida receives, as I kind of told you in that little vignette, some of the most intense rainfall in the country. And if you've lived here for any period of time, you've probably experienced some of those summer thunderstorms where the sky turns dark, lightning fills the horizon, and rain falls so hard you can't see across the street. And we get rain in a period of, let's say, 4 to 5 month period each year. And then, which is a lot of reasons why people move to Florida, from October, November, all the way to March or April, we don't get a lot of rain. I mean, it is beautiful. It is 70s and 80s, sunny skies, no rain. We actually go through a lot of times we have a drought during the winter, right? And so the rain that I'm talking about is happening. They're intense rainfalls, and they're happening in a short 3 to 4, maybe 5 month period, our hurricane season, our summer season here in Florida. And all this rain can happen, inches of rain in 30 or 45 minutes, and then the sun will come out. Those afternoon thunderstorms are part of life here. And most of the time, our drainage systems handle them just fine. But when several inches of rain fall in a very short period of time, and when the ground is already super saturated, like it is today from previous storms, then water has no place to go. And sometimes it'll find its way into our homes. And that's what makes flood insurance such an important conversation. Not just for homes near the Gulf, but for families throughout the Greater Tampa Bay area. So let me give you an example. Imagine two families. One purchases a home overlooking the Gulf in a little town called Hudson, little north of where we live here in Palm Harbor. The other buys a home 25 miles inland in Wesley Chapel. And most people would immediately assume that the waterfront home carries the greater flood risk. But that's not always the case. The Gulffront property may primarily worry about flooding during a storm surge during hurricanes. The inland home property may primarily worry about, have a different set of challenges based on heavy rainfall overwhelming neighborhood drainage systems. Both properties have flood risk. The source of that risk is what's different. And that's an important distinction every buyer here in Florida, and especially the Greater Tampa Bay area, should understand. So what exactly causes flooding? That answer, at least here in Florida, isn't as simple as a hurricane. In fact, here in Florida, there are 5 primary types of flooding that every homeowner should understand. And each different type has different causes, different levels of risk, and different implications for your property. So let's walk through them real quick. The first one everybody's kind of familiar with is storm surge. And that's the type of flooding which receives, most of the media attention. You've got the person in the rain jacket, slicker, with the TV camera down at the beach, watching the rains come over the seawall and over the beach and into town. And when a hurricane is approaching, it has just intense power. We were here during Milton, and we watched on camera as Hurricane Milton sucked out all the water in Tampa Bay till you could see just the mud on the ground. The entire Bay of Tampa was mud flats. People were out there walking. And several hours later, as the bands came through, the storm brought all the water back in, and then the surge, where an additional 3-4 feet of water came over the ground and moved inland. And that power is just awesome. I'd never seen it before, and it was amazing to see what Mother Nature can do. Communities like Clearwater Beach, Treasure Island, Madeira Beach, Gulfport, portions of St. Petersburg, and low-lying neighborhoods throughout Pinellas and Pasco counties are especially vulnerable to storm surge. And there's just no getting around it. When that happens, and if there's a direct hit on that area, even tens of miles north or south of where a hurricane comes ashore, you'll see that. But here's something important to understand. Storm surge just isn't big waves. It's that, what I explained, it's several feet of additional water above normal tide or even high tide. And once that water comes over the beach, it has nowhere to go, right? It goes in homes, and it causes flood damage, and a lot of it is driven by wind, but it's flood damage, not wind damage, right? Which is important to understand when you read your homeowner's insurance and you talk about wind damage versus flood damage. And that's why there's separate policies between homeowners insurance and flood insurance. One of the first questions home buyers considering waterfront property should ask is, have you looked at both the flood zone and the evacuation zone? They're not the same thing. A home can be in a lower risk flood zone. I have a home that's a mile from the beach. It's flood zone X, 35 feet above sea level. But it still could be in an evacuation zone based on a number of factors that come with being exposed to hurricanes. Understanding both and the differences can give you a more complete understanding of the risk associated with your property. 2, we talked about this too, rainfall flooding. And you don't want to ever have people moving to Florida underestimate the power of rain. Not every flood requires a named storm, not even a tropical storm, although most of those are named. Here in the Tampa Bay area, it's not unusual for a summer thunderstorm, as we said, to produce several inches of rain in a very short period of time. If you lived in the mountains in New England or in North Carolina or Tennessee, a quick 2, 3, 4 inches of rain quickly can also overwhelm small creeks and rivers and lead to flooding in those areas. It's a similar idea based on different terrain and what's happening. And if you've lived here for any sort of amount of time, you've seen those times when roads temporarily disappear and there's standing water after a flood zone. If you were in downtown Tampa on Dale Mabry Road, south of Kennedy, which isn't important if you're not here, but that is a 4-lane road that becomes a 2-lane road because the outer lanes going north and south fill up 6-8 inches of water, and I've seen cars flood out and are stranded in the middle of downtown during a normal rainstorm. It just is what it is. There's nowhere for the water to go. Most of the time when that happens, our sewer systems handle the water and they do just great. And I'd say most of the time, but sometimes it doesn't. And if the storm drains can't handle it and the retention ponds are already full and the ground is super saturated like it is today as I'm filming this, water begins to collect in places it normally wouldn't. Driveways become ponds, garages take on water, homes that have never flooded may suddenly experience water intrusion. And one of the biggest surprises buyers relocating from other parts of the country learn is that you don't have to live near the Gulf to experience flood damage. Rainfall flooding affects communities here in Florida every year. So just be aware. Number 3, river and creek flooding. This is probably similar to other areas of the country. And that's when rivers and creeks and canals overflow their banks. And here in this region, water waters and rivers like the Hillsborough River, the Alafia River, the Enclote River, and smaller creeks throughout Pasco and Hernando counties, they can rise significantly after prolonged rainfall. And unlike flash flooding, river flooding often develops over several days. And the good news is we can actually forecast that when it's happening. The challenge is that once the water leaves the banks and overflows the banks, the water there has nowhere to go, and it can last a lot longer, right? You can see it in fields, you can see it in those low areas where it'll just stay. So if you're purchasing a home near a river or creek or a canal or even a lake, it's worth asking your realtor and insurance professional about the property history. Not just whether it's in a flood zone, but whether it's ever experienced flooding during extended periods of heavy rain. Okay, number 4, neighborhood drainage and retention pond flowing. So we have so much water and so many lakes and ponds and bodies of water here in Central Florida and around the Greater Tampa area. You're going to see these retention ponds everywhere. We actually build neighborhoods in swampy areas, and we build them up, and then where it used to be a swamp and where there isn't a golf course, they clear that out and they make them large retention ponds to hold all the water. These ponds are not decorative. Yes, they have a lot of wildlife, and yes, they're great for fishing, and yes, they look beautiful, and yes, they increase maybe the price or the value of your home because it's on water, but they aren't decorative. They're engineered stormwater systems designed to temporarily hold rainwater and release it gradually, helping reduce the flood risk in your neighborhood. Under normal conditions, they really work well, right? As we get to the springtime through the winter, the drought is coming to an end, the water levels are low, rainy season starts, monsoon season starts, they will start to fill up. And it's just a natural process throughout the year. But if we get too much rain in a short period of time, they too can flood, and houses around them can become vulnerable. That's why when I'm helping buyers evaluate a property, I encourage them to do more than just look at the house itself. Look at the neighborhood. Notice the grading. Where does the land slope? Is the home lower than the surrounding properties? How close is it to a retention pond? And does the backyard appear to collect water? Sometimes the answers to these questions are just as valuable as having or understanding the flood map. And number 5, urban flooding. So I've seen this in other areas of the country too. But as our communities continue to grow, more land is covered with roads and sidewalks and parking lots and buildings and pavement, which does not absorb water, right? If you've ever lived in Texas, especially in Houston, it's solid pavement, and they have some of the worst flooding in the nation every time there's a hurricane comes through or heavy rains in the Houston area. Same thing can happen in places like St. Petersburg and Tampa here. And that when we get those heavy, intense rains outside of storms, the rainwater has to move quickly into the storms systems, which places greater demands on the drainage infrastructure. And again, most of the time it works great. And that doesn't mean growth is bad. It just simply means that storm management really becomes increasingly important as our communities develop. And you want to know how well that works where you're buying. It's also a good reminder that flood risk isn't determined by a single factor. It's really, influenced by topography. It's influenced by infrastructure and rainfall and development. And that's what's important, is there's specific characteristics that impact each individual property, and understanding those is the real key. At this point, you may be thinking, Alex, this sounds like every home in Florida has some flood risk. And in many ways, that's probably true. The question isn't whether risk exists. The question is how much risk? And what can you do to prepare for it? What can you do to mitigate it? And that's exactly why understanding flood zones, insurance quotes, insurance options, the property history is so important before you buy. Because informed buyers make better decisions, and better decisions lead to fewer surprises after closing. All right, so here's your today's mission intel. One of the most common statements I hear is, I'm not required to carry flood insurance, so I must not need it, right? What I want you to remember is this. The renter's requirement is based on lending guidelines, not your personal comfort level with financial risk. Think of it this way. If you pay cash for a home, no one's requiring you to carry homeowners insurance either. But would you choose to go without homeowners insurance even if you owned it outright? Probably not. Flood insurance works much the same way. The absence of requirements doesn't eliminate the possibility of loss. It simply means the decision becomes yours. And that's why I encourage every home buyer to make an informed decision based on the facts, not on assumptions. One question I hear all the time is, Alex, how do I know if my home is in a flood zone? All right, good question. But I'd like to change it just a little bit. Instead of asking, is this home in a flood zone? I really think the better question is, what does this flood zone actually tell me? Because here's something most people don't realize. A flood zone isn't a prediction, it's a planning tool. It's FEMA's best estimate of the likelihood that a property could experience flooding under certain conditions. It helps lenders, insurance companies, builders, local governments, and homeowners make informed decisions about risk. But it's only one piece of the puzzle. So let's walk through an example together. Picture this. It's Saturday morning, and you and I are touring a home in Palm Harbor. We stop at two properties. They're both listed at $550,000. Both are 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom. They were built about the same time. They have newer roofs, beautifully maintained. And at first glance, they look almost exactly the same. Then we pull up the FEMA flood map. The first house is located in a flood zone X on the map. The second is in zone AE. And immediately you as the buyer ask, Alex, what does this mean? So let's break it down. And what I want to explain to you, just as an example, I was looking at a home in Carrollwood, which is just a little north of the Tampa airport. And in that area, you will have one home that's flood zone X, and the house right next to it or right across the street is flood zone AE. You would assume if you looked at a number of houses, you might find 5 or 6 on the same street that are all X, and you would assume that the one just across the street isn't. But because of underwater aquifers and how water drains through that area of the city, 2 totally different houses, and they're within 20 meters of each other, mailbox to mailbox. So what is flood zone X? Flood zone X is generally considered a lower risk flood area. What I want you to notice is I didn't say no risk, it's lower risk. And that's an important distinction. A home in zone X can absolutely flood. Heavy rainfall, neighborhood drainage issues, overflowing retention ponds, changing development, all of these still can create flooding. The difference is that FEMA estimates the statistical likelihood to be lower than properties located in a special flood hazard areas, right? And because of that, most federally backed loans don't require flood insurance for flood zone X. But remember, we discussed this earlier. Not required doesn't mean unnecessary, okay? One of the biggest mistakes buyers make is confusing lender requirements with personal risk. So your lender is protecting their investment. You need to protect your investment. What is flood zone AE? It's considered a special flood hazard area, AE. And in simple terms, FEMA estimates that there's a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. And when I was growing up in Vermont, we would hear about, the 100-year flood. And I always thought, well, that only happens every 100 years. Maybe it's a cyclical, natural thing. But I learned that I really don't want to use that phrase because it makes people think that it only happens once every 100 years. And that's not what it means. It means there's roughly a 1% chance annually of a flood of the magnitude a flood occurring at that location, right? So every year, it's like rolling dice or flipping a coin. And you roll the dice, and you roll the dice, and what's the chances of getting snake eyes, or if you have 3 or 4 dice, getting 4 ones? It could be 1 in every 100 rolls or 200 rolls, but it also could be on your 30th roll and on your 75th roll, right? That could happen multiple times in 100 years. And over the course of time, that risk adds up. And that's why lenders generally require flood insurance for homes in zone AE when the mortgage is backed by a federally regulated lender. Excuse me. So why can 2 similar homes have very different insurance costs? 2 homes, same street, built by the same builder, same size, same floor plan, and yet they can have dramatically different insurance premiums. Why? Because insurance companies aren't just looking at the address, right? They're not just looking at the neighborhood. They're looking at things like the property elevation, the base flood elevation established by FEMA, the first floor elevation of the home, the home's history of flood claims, the amount of coverage you choose, and even whether the policy is through the National Flood Insurance Program or a private carrier. Sometimes a home that's a few feet higher maybe than another can save significantly on flood insurance costs, just a few feet. And that's one reason I always encourage buyers to look beyond the list price. The true cost of home ownership includes your mortgage, your property taxes, your homeowner's insurance, your flood insurance, if applicable, your HOA dues, your maintenance, and your utilities, right? Those are your true costs. And when we compare homes, we compare the total cost of ownership, not just the asking price. Because a home that's $10,000 less expensive up front could cost thousands more if it's a few feet lower, like we just talked about, if it requires flood insurance and has higher costs on premiums. So what about elevation certificates? You may have heard about those. And don't let the name be intimidating. Think of it just as a survey that documents how high a home's lowest floor is in relation to the FEMA base flood elevation, okay? For some homes, particular ones, older ones, an elevation certificate can provide valuable information when determining flood insurance premiums. Not every property needs one, not every insurer requires one, but if one actually already exists, it can be a helpful document to review during your due diligence. So here's my buying tip for today. And here's something I recommend every buyer work with. Don't wait until the week of closing to obtain your insurance quotes. Just like we talked about with homeowner insurance, flood insurance is just the same. As soon as you go under contract, get with an insurance professional, request a homeowner's insurance quote, and ask whether flood insurance should also be considered. And you may ask why. Because flood insurance, or insurance in general, those costs affect your affordability, what you can afford in a home. And if the premium is much higher than expected, I would rather know that earlier while I'm still in the inspection period and before I lose maybe a down payment or something on a home. I'll still have time to evaluate my options, and I can do that several weeks in advance versus a couple days before closing. And as we know, those are the times when emotions are high and those decisions become much harder. It actually becomes harder to pull out of a deal when you're that close, right? And you may assume things that you wish later you hadn't assumed. Preparation gives you choice, and waiting always limits your choices. So here's some questions every buyer should ask. And so whenever I'm working with a buyer in Florida, I encourage them to ask these questions that go beyond the obvious. Has this property ever experienced flooding? Okay, that may be kind of obvious, but has a flood insurance claim ever been filed on this property? Does the current owner carry flood insurance? Good to know. Maybe an indicator. If so, what's the annual premium? Sometimes these are transferable, which is great. Is the property located in an evacuation zone? Has the owner completed any drainage improvements to the home? Are there any nearby canals, ponds, or waterways? Has the neighborhood experienced any flooding during recent hurricanes or unusually heavy rainfall? And those questions don't automatically eliminate a property. They simply help you understand the full picture before making one of the biggest financial decisions of your life. So, a lesson from the field. I'd like to leave you with something I've learned in my 30 years in the Army. And one of the principles we live by was really simple. Never confuse the absence of evidence with the absence of risk, right? Just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't happen tomorrow. Every mission I did began with an assessment. We studied the terrain. We studied weather. We evaluated intelligence. We identified vulnerabilities to the plan. We developed a plan. Your home deserves that same mindset. Flood maps, insurance quotes, property history, inspections. These are all pieces of the same puzzle. None of them guarantee success by themselves, but together they help you make informed decisions. And informed decisions reduce surprises. And that's what preparation is all about. So now that you understand how flooding happens, we've talked about FEMA flood zones. We've looked at why two houses on the same street can have very different levels of risk. The next question, yeah, it could be a mission. The next question becomes, how do I choose the right flood insurance? And for many buyers, this is where things begin to feel overwhelming. There are different policies, different companies, different coverages, different deductibles. And that's a lot of unfamiliar territory for most people. The good news is you don't have to become an insurance expert. You just need to understand the right questions to ask. And let's start with one of the biggest misconceptions. Homeowners insurance is not flood insurance. We talked about this a little bit in the last episode. And we talked about the role homeowners insurance plays in protecting your investment. We also discussed one of its biggest limitations, and that's it doesn't cover the damage from rising water. And we repeated it twice last week. I'll repeat it again. Homeowners insurance doesn't generally cover damage caused by rising water. If a pipe bursts inside your home, by and large covered by your homeowners insurance. If rain enters through a hole in the roof, damaged by wind, that may be covered by your homeowners insurance policy. But if water rises from the ground and enters your home, whether it's from a storm, overflowing rivers, rainfall, storm surge, your drainage system in the neighborhood is overwhelmed, that's generally considered flood damage. And that's why flood insurance has to be a separate policy. And one of the biggest surprises homeowners experience after a major storm is they discover that two neighbors can have similar damage, but very different insurance coverage, depending on what caused the water to enter the home. And understanding that distinction before you ever need to file a claim can save you a tremendous amount of stress later. So where do you buy flood insurance? Many buyers assume there's only one place to purchase flood insurance. Although that used to be the case, it is no longer the case. Today's homeowners have generally two options. The first is the Natural Flood Insurance Program, often called the NFIP. And that's administered by the federal government and has been helping homeowners for decades manage flood risk. The second option, the newer option, is private flood insurance, offered by a growing number of insurance companies. Both options can provide valuable protections, and depending on the property, they can offer different pricing, higher coverage limits, or maybe additional features than the other. That's why I really encourage buyers to work with an experienced insurance professional who can really compare and explain the differences. Just like shopping for a mortgage, it's worth shopping for insurance the same way. What does flood insurance actually cover? Good question. While every policy is different, flood insurance generally focuses on two categories. The first is the building itself. And that can include things like the foundation, the electrical and plumbing, the HVAC equipment, water heaters, built-in appliances, flooring, and permanently installed cabinets. The second category is your personal belongings. And that could include furniture, clothing, electronics, area rugs on the floor, and many of the everyday things that makes life feel like home. However, not everything is covered automatically. So some policies have separate limits for contents. Others may require you to get additional coverage depending on your needs. And that's, again, why it's really important to talk with an insurance professional. Not only about how much coverage you have, but what that coverage actually includes. What might it not cover? This part of our discussion today may be one of the most important parts. And many homeowners assume that if they have flood insurance, everything's covered. Not necessarily, okay? Depending on the policy, there may be limitations or exclusions to things like outdoor landscaping. All your bushes, trees get killed. Your swimming pool gets damaged. Fences, patios, screened in lanais, cash, important documents, things that get destroyed if they're left in the home, valuable collectibles, and even the temporary living expenses if you have to move out while your home is being repaired. So I always encourage my buyers to ask a simple question. Instead of asking, what does this policy cover? Please also ask, what doesn't it cover? Sometimes the answer to the second question can be even more important. All right, let's talk about a little bit about deductibles. A deductible is simply the amount you're responsible for paying before your insurance coverage begins, right? So generally speaking, a higher deductible may lower your annual premium, and a lower deductible may inversely create a higher premium. There's no right or wrong answer there. The right deductible is the one that's right for your financial situation. But I always encourage people to ask themselves this: if something happened to my home, how much could I comfortably afford to pay out of pocket? Right? That's really what a deductible is. How much am I going to pay out of pocket? Is it $1,000? Is it $10,000? Is it $50,000? Those are the questions. And it's important to have those questions and those discussions and get that answer for you before you choose your policy. The last one or the next question is, don't wait until the hurricane season. And one of the mistakes that I also see every year is somebody waits until April, May, and they're going into the hurricane season, and they're like, I had that conversation with my neighbor down the street, and we were talking about hurricanes, and I'm starting to think maybe I should have gotten flood insurance. And then they start seeing something on the news, a tropical storm is forming or a big storm is coming. And they're like, I'm going to call my insurance provider and I'm going to get flood insurance. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, right? Because the companies have been burned like that before, right? So a flood insurance premium may include a waiting period, right? Before your coverage becomes effective. It could be different lengths of time, but if you have a 1 week or a 1 month waiting period and you have a storm that's going to hit in 3 days, you may have just bought flood insurance that's going to do nothing for you. So preparation always beats reaction. And that's not only a tip for today with regards to home ownership, but it also is just a great lesson for life. I think we'd all agree. So what I tell my clients when my buyers ask, do you think I should buy flood insurance? I don't answer yes or no, right? That is their decision. Because every property, every family, every financial situation is different. Instead, I want to ask them questions. What is the property's what's the flood history? Sorry. What flood zone is it in? Another great question. How much are the premiums for flood insurance? Could I or could they comfortably recover financially if their home was flooded and you didn't have coverage? And my job, again, it's not to make that decision for you, it's to educate you. It's to make sure you understand the risks, the costs, the available options so you can make the decision that's right for your family. That's what good realtors should do. We educate, we prepare, and we help our clients make informed decisions. So here's my buying tip for the day. It's a practical tip that can help buyers save both money and frustration. As soon as you're under contract on your home, request your homeowner's insurance quote and a flood insurance quote, both. Even if flood insurance isn't required by your lender. Why, you should ask? Because insurance costs are part of the total cost of your home, right? We talked about that just a little bit earlier, but I'll reiterate it again. And again, I'd rather understand and discover early that a property's insurance premiums are higher than I thought and they're going to affect my budget. And that really will help you as the buyer compare homes more accurately and avoid unexpected kind of financial surprises. And remember, you're not really just buying a home, you're buying the monthly cost of home ownership. Understanding the full financial picture is one of the smartest things that you can do and that I can help you do. All right, so as we wrap up today's mission, let's take a moment to review what we've learned. Today's episode wasn't really about flood insurance. It was about understanding risk, right? One of the things I appreciate most about working with people in real estate is that every family has a different story. Some are buying their very first home. Others are buying that retirement home after a long career. Some are just moving across the country to be closer to family, and others are beginning a brand new chapter after a major life change, like I did when I retired. Every family is different, but every family deserves to understand the home that they're buying. Not just the square footage, not just the neighborhood, not just the interest rate, not just the long-term. It's about the long-term responsibilities that come with homeownership. And flood insurance, quite frankly, is one of those responsibilities. Not because every home is going to flood, but because every homeowner should understand the risks before deciding how to protect what they've worked so hard to buy. Knowledge doesn't eliminate risk. It helps us prepare for it. And preparation creates confidence. We've said that over and over. So before we finish today, here are 3 things that I want you to remember. 3 takeaways. First, every property has some level of flood risk. And whether your home sits on the Gulf, or your neighborhood is next to a pond, or you're inland 50 miles, water doesn't care about zip codes. It follows gravity. And understanding how water moves around your property is just as important as understanding the property itself. Second, don't confuse a lender's requirements with your own financial protection. Just because flood insurance isn't required doesn't automatically make it so you shouldn't consider it. Your lender they're protecting their investment, and you need to think about protecting your investment. And that's a personal decision. And it's one that should be made with good information and not assumptions. And third, the best time to understand your flood risk is before you close on your home. Not after the first tropical storm, not after the first hurricane warning, and certainly not after you've experienced water intrusion into your home. The best decisions are always made before there's an emergency, right? That's true in real estate. It's true in life. Over and over, I'm reminded of that. So here's my final thought. Over the past 30 years in the Army, I've learned that successful missions rarely depend on luck. I really don't believe in luck. They depend on preparation. In the Army, I studied maps, identified risks, evaluated terrain, planned for contingencies. Because when the unexpected happened, and eventually it always did, Murphy was there, I wasn't making an emotional decision. If I had a plan, I could always flex off the plan. If I didn't have a plan, I couldn't flex. I was shooting from the hip. But in the Army, I was always flexing off a plan. And buying a home, although it's not a military mission, it is one of the biggest financial decisions of most families will ever make. And the families that enjoy homeownership the most aren't necessarily those with the biggest house or the newest house or even the least expensive house. They're the ones who understand what they're getting into when they're buying. They ask good questions, and they surround themselves with knowledgeable professionals. And they make informed decisions before problems become expensive. And that's what preparation looks like. So here's your mission this week. If you already own a home, take a few minutes, break out your paperwork, and understand your property's flood risk. Look up your FEMA flood map, review your current insurance coverage. And if you aren't sure whether you have flood insurance, call your insurance agent, right? Just double check. Maybe it's time to have another conversation on flood insurance. And it's a simple conversation, and it's one, it's something you shouldn't be afraid to discuss. If you're planning to buy something in the next couple months, ask your realtor to discuss the flood risk before you make an offer, right? You should be able to walk through these questions with me as your realtor, as your real estate professional, to better understand it. Request insurance quotes while you're still in that inspection period, right? Do it early, right when you go under contract. Ask what if the property's had previous flooding. Find out whether the seller carries flood insurance, right? And remember, the goal isn't to find a home with zero risk. They all have risk. The goal is to understand it well enough to make confident decisions, right? Understanding that risk, what you can mitigate, what you can't, and then make those good decisions. To help you get started, I've created a free companion resource I like to call mission guides, and some of these episodes have them, but this one's on flood insurance, has a flood insurance buyer's checklist. Included in it, you'll see the questions that we reviewed to ask before purchasing a home, flood insurance comparison worksheet, a property research checklist. I threw in a list of helpful websites and local resources, and a place to organize your insurance quotes and policy information. So whether you're buying next month or next year, it'll help you make more informed decisions. And so you can download it now. Just go to the show notes. You'll see my website. If you go up to the upper right corner, you'll see the Next Mission podcast. You can use the menu there to select the documents. If you're buying, selling, or simply have questions about home ownership anywhere here in the Greater Tampa Bay area, I'd be honored to be a resource for you. If you live somewhere else and you are looking for a really great realtor, I have a network, and through Berkshire Hathaway, just an incredible company, I can put you in touch with a great professional. So just reach out to me. Sometimes working with you will help maybe lead you to buy a home, and sometimes our discussions may lead you to decide to postpone. Maybe it's a month, maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a couple of years until you're ready to buy that home that you want. Either way, my goal is really the same. I want to educate you first. I want to listen to you carefully, understand your goals and what you're trying to accomplish, and then help you make the best decision for you and your family. Because a good real estate agent doesn't use pressure. They want you to be prepared. All right. As I do each time, thank you for spending part of your day with me. I know this was a longer episode, but hopefully you found it very valuable. If you did find this helpful, I'd love it if you'd share it with a friend or a family member, a coworker, a neighbor. I'd also love it if you signed up for this podcast. That would be great. That just helps us. And I'd love it if you provide some feedback, right? I'm 10 episodes in. I'm new at this, and I would love your feedback to make it better. I believe that the more informed we are as homeowners, the better decisions we're going to make. And that's good for our families, our communities, and our future. And remember, the preparation we do now creates confidence. Communication between us and that team that we're building builds trust. And education, and I'm learning every day too, really reduces anxiety. Every single successful mission begins with a plan. Don't forget that. I'm Alex Leonovich. Until next time, take care of your home, take care of your family, and I'll see you on the next mission. Thanks. Have a great week.